Good morning. According to my clock, we're a couple minutes past starting time. My name is Chad Orton. I'm the moderator for this session, which is entitled, make sure I get that, Saints, Sites, and Rescue Companies, a Church History Potpourri. And we welcome all of you, both here with us in Iowa, but also in various locations around at least the United States and Canada. We know about people who have tuned in and elsewhere. And we want to get started as fast as we can to leave time for questions. And for those of you who are watching by Zoom, you will have an opportunity to use that feature to submit questions at the end as well. Our first speaker is Wendy Cope Todd. She is an independent historian who was born and raised in Idaho Falls, Idaho. She attended Brigham Young University and is married to Brent L, a professor emeritus of Church History and Doctrine at Brigham Young University. They have 4 children, 25 grandchildren, and 1 great-granddaughter. She is the author of 2 books, as well as chapters in 2 other historical works, and has co-authored several books with her husband. She has worked as a researcher in LDS Church History for over 8 years with Dr. Richard Bennett and Dr. Kerry Muhlstein at Brigham Young University. Her interest in the poor camps developed through an effort to trace the path of her own ancestors. Our second speaker will be Jed Woodworth. Jed is a historian employed by the Church History Department in Salt Lake City. He is currently the managing historian of Saints, the new official history of the church. Prior to joining the Church History Department, he was employed by the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he earned a PhD in history. Jed also has degrees from BYU and Harvard. When not doing history, he enjoys working in a community garden in Lehi, Utah, where he lives, along with his wife Shauna and their 6 children, ranging in ages from 16 to 1. Our concluding speaker will be Glenn Rawson. He was born and raised in Idaho. He grew up on a cattle ranch and to this day still carries a little bit of cowboy in him. When he was 18 years old, he joined the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and later served a mission for the church here in Iowa. He graduated from Brigham Young University with a degree in wildlife and range sciences, and later from Idaho State University with a master's degree in education. And he spent almost 20 years as a seminary and institute teacher. In 1997, he began writing and producing stories for the radio. Then in 2008, he joined with KJAZ Television in Salt Lake City and the Joseph Smith Papers team to produce a weekly documentary television series entitled The Joseph Smith Papers. In 2010, he teamed with Dennis Lyman and Bryant Bush to produce a new series called The History of the Saints, and many of you, I'm sure, have watched these. Glenn and his wife, Debbie, have 7 children, and is that 18 grandchildren? Am I reading that right? You changed that? Okay. And Glenn has traveled around the world leading history, church history, and other tours since 2012. And so, Wendy, we'll turn the time over to you.
Thank you for that introduction, and figure out how to work the clicker here. I'm grateful to be here today, and hope that you will enjoy this story, a little-known story in the saga of the Latter-day Saints, the last of the Latter-day Saints in Nauvoo. The best-laid plans for the exodus of the Latter-day Saints from Nauvoo, Illinois, in the spring of 1846, crafted by President Brigham Young and his fellow apostles in the governing council of the church, went quickly awry before they could be carried out. Threats of government intervention in the Saints' move west and rumors of attempts on the lives of church leaders resulted in the carefully planned exodus becoming a more or less haphazard escape. Most Latter-day Saints and some others would say that the bulk, if not all, of the saints left Nauvoo in this storied early February crossing into Iowa, and few would know that it was not according to plan. The emergency departure was initially intended primarily for the 12 and their families to find safety and establish a way station to the west. And though many saints insisted on tagging along unprepared, the company still only consisted of 2,000 to 3,000 of the 12 or more thousand saints in the Nauvoo area. Not many understand that most of the saints drifted out of Nauvoo in small groups and families throughout the spring and summer. These things are not part of common Latter-day Saint lore. Still fewer have realized that by September, the most helpless remained in Illinois. 700 to 1,000 beleaguered saints, according to estimates, remained in Nauvoo in early September 1846, hindered by pervasive sickness, death, poverty, and the inability to sell property and procure equipment and supplies. This number was very fluid, but included recent converts and other gatherers who had just arrived there with no means left to go further. It also included the wives and families of men who had gone to establish themselves in western Iowa. Some of them were intending to return for their families, but had joined the Mormon battalion at the request of Brigham Young, who had promised to care for their dependents. A few others were widows with no means of support or travel, left to manage with their families as best they could, under the care of 3 trustees who were left in Nauvoo to take care of church property and other temporal concerns. Adding to these difficulties, the remaining inhabitants were weak and even dying from a lack of food. Mobs had hemmed in the last of the saints' burning crops or preventing their harvesting in the outlying farms. Thomas Bullock, a clerk for the church, lamented that many were dying even as they prepared to go west. Despite the efforts of these last saints to leave, the anti-Mormon forces in Hancock County, Illinois, grew impatient. Having systematically harassed and attacked those who might venture out to find food, the anti-Mormons finally attacked the mostly empty city, resulting in what was called the Battle of Nauvoo. Latter-day Saints fought back in defense of their temple and city. The main battle began September 10th and lasted through September 14th, with skirmishes through the 17th, basically ending in a draw, though the Nauvoo citizens knew they could not hold out any longer. A committee from Quincy, Illinois, helped work out the details of the surrender and evacuation of the city. According to the agreement, the saints would leave as quickly as they could, and the anti-Mormon forces would be allowed into the city on the 18th to confiscate weapons. A significant number of the mob who came in at that time were drunken, disorderly, and determined to drive the Mormons out immediately. The saints, as well as some of the new citizens who were not LDS but who had fought to protect the city, were treated very roughly and forced across the river at the point of a gun or sword, with little or no time to gather food or supplies. There was no mercy for the poor and the sick, as hundreds of them who could hardly walk or who had no means of transport lined the banks of the Mississippi, frantically trying to escape the mob. They ended up strung out in camps along the Mississippi River on the Iowa side for about 2 miles above Montrose. Thomas Kane, who had helped the exiled saints arrange for the service of the Mormon battalion in July at Mount Pisgah, came across the scene on his return to the east in the last week of September. A year and a half later, he wrote of their terrible conditions, concluding, "I have not the satisfaction of a doubt that among those I looked upon thus shivering in the sharp night air of autumn, many of whom the screening of a roof might have saved, died looking across the stream upon their comfortable homes, in which the orthodox bullies of the mob were celebrating their triumph in obscene and drunken riot." Kane estimated the number in the camps at about 640. Bishop Newell K. Whitney, responsible for the temporal welfare of church members, came upon the scene before help arrived and later told church leaders at headquarters that 50 wagons would suffice to pick up the stragglers. He may have considered the fact that there were wagons already in the camp that were merely in needed teams. The situation was constantly fluctuating, however. Those who had or could obtain the means were leaving the camp as fast as possible. Others left for nearby towns such as Bonaparte, or went as far as St. Louis to work until they had enough money to follow the main camp. The Burlington Hawkeye the newspaper, the Burlington Hawkeye, noted that boatloads, stages, and private vehicles were arriving in that place with refugees, while other boatloads of Mormons were leaving to help at the camps. And finally, as Kane noted, some in the camps were dying, though no count was ever kept. Meanwhile, in April, Brigham Young and the 12 had already authorized the Nauvoo trustees to sell the temple to help the poor immigrants. Their efforts were unsuccessful, and on July 7th, just as the February Exodus Company was struggling to send off the men of the Mormon Battalion, Brigham Young began to realize that they would need to bring the poorer saints to the Missouri themselves. On September 7th, before the Battle of Nauvoo occurred, President Young again suggested to the Winter Quarters High Council that they needed to send for the poor immediately. Immediate action was difficult at the time, however. The exiles trying to dig in for the winter at the Missouri River were in little better condition than the saints stranded at the Mississippi. It would be a case of the poor and sick rescuing the poorer and sicker. Yet by September 14th, 1846, the saints at what would become Winter Quarters were able to send off a rescue party that included 20 wagons, 36 yoke of cattle, and 11 men headed by Orville M. Allen. In addition, Young gave him a list of people to bring to Winter Quarters, including saints such as Clerk Thomas Bullock, whose services were needed there. Orville Allen and his men, who learned about the Battle of Nauvoo from those on the trail west, awakened the stranded poor saints in Montrose, Iowa, early on the morning of October 7th. He gathered up those he had been sent to find along with their families. Some of the rescuers with him had come back for their own families and had little or no room in their wagons for others. Thus, many available spots were already taken by those better prepared. Additionally, some of those in the poor camp who had their own wagons but needed teams were not willing or able to take needy passengers. In the end, Allen's return company did finally agree to take 3 widows and 44 who were listed as sick. Later, Henry Young, along with several other inhabitants of the camp, sent a letter to Brigham Young after Allen's departure, complaining that the wagon train had left the most indigent behind. However, on the morning of the 9th, when the Allen Company was about to depart, both the indigent and the prepared were blessed with what they all exclaimed was a miracle. Large flocks of quail flew directly into the camps and landed everywhere around so that men, women, and even children could grab them with their hands. The weakened group feasted on quail that day until their hunger was momentarily satisfied, like the children of Israel in the wilderness. For a moment, there was abundant joy and renewed hope. This miracle is well known in the church, but few understand the full context. Thomas Bullock, who kept a diary of the return, noted on October 22nd that a few more wagons and people had joined their camp, making their total 28 wagons, 47 yoke of oxen, and 157 people. Although he later noted that some of these parties left them before their arrival at Winter Quarters. Their return trip took more than 6 weeks and covered 532 miles. And I might note here that one of the reasons that this trip took so long was because of the cattle that were mentioned in the last session, that the cattle were constantly wandering off and they lost many days searching for cattle. Also, there were 2 women who died along the way. One of the reasons the full story of the poor camps has not often been told in LDS history may be that little was known about a second rescue company until recent years. Not until 1986 did Richard Bennett first shed light on what he called this heretofore little-known second rescue mission, excuse me, that left Council Bluffs about the 2nd of October. On September 24th, news of the Battle of Nauvoo and the expulsion of the remaining saints had reached church leaders at winter quarters. The news of the refugees' pitiful conditions on the west bank of the Mississippi stirred President Brigham Young. On September 28th, he and other leading brethren at winter quarters, who had sent off the first rescue group, sent a letter to the High Council at Council Bluff on the eastern side of the Missouri, informing them of the crisis, followed by this exhortation reminding church members of the covenant some had made first in Missouri, again in the October conference of 1845, and yet again in the Nauvoo temple, to sacrifice all they had to help the poor gather with the saints. Let the fire of the covenant which you made in the house of the Lord burn in your hearts like flame unquenchable till you, by yourselves or delegates, have searched out every man within your council limits who has his arrangements made for the winter or can leave them for others to make, and impart the fire to his soul till he shall rise up with his team and go straightway and bring a load of the poor from Nauvoo. However, the members on the Iowa side of the Missouri, having responsibility for most of the battalion families, felt they were already giving all they could. Responsive nonetheless, a second rescue team from the Council Bluffs area was on the road to eastern Iowa shortly after October 2nd. James Murdoch and Alan Taylor were chosen to lead this company with an unknown number of men, wagons, and teams. The Murdoch-Taylor wagon train arrived at the poor camp near the end of October. Undoubtedly, this camp of rescuers deserves a great deal of credit, but there is no record of their passengers or of the details of their actual journey. Thomas Bullock, traveling with the first company and keeping a diary, noted that the second company caught up to and passed them on November 15th. Bullock complained that it had taken 37 days for his company to get to the point where they then were, but only 17 days for the Murdoch-Taylor Company to reach the same spot. This would indicate that perhaps the Murdoch-Taylor Company was smaller. And this would mean that the Murdoch-Taylor Company had departed the Montrose area as late as October 30th. Since its discovery, most historians have supposed that this second rescue team gathered up the rest of the saints who wanted to leave the poor camp. This may have obscured the fact that there was yet another rescue company, even less known. The record of this company has lain buried in the diaries of Luman Andro Shurtleff and a few other saints who were rescued by him. It has received a few passing mentions over the years, but none that raised any interest. And yet Shurtleff's account is detailed and interesting and would be highly faith-promoting for believers. Many fortuitous incidents are recorded, both going and returning, that Shurtleff readily attributed to the divine hand. In this journey, he declared, the hand of God was manifest to all who was acquainted with the circumstances, close quote. Copies of the previously mentioned letter from winter quarters had been sent not only to Council Bluffs, but also to Garden Grove and Mount Pisgah, where saints who had been too poor or sick to travel any further in the spring had been left to plant crops, recover from illness, and create way stations for those who followed. Shurtleff, one of the leaders at the Garden Grove settlement, later recorded the experience in several different writings. The above letter was received just as he was finishing his home. In less than one day, the settlers there were able to furnish 18 yoke of oxen and wagons and teamsters. Shurtleff was chosen to be captain of the rescue. He reported, "The next morning when we came together to start, 75 cents was all the expense money raised to accomplish a journey of 340 miles. This was the best we could do, so we loaded in some squashes and pumpkins for the teams and rolled out, thus equipped to gather home the poor saints. This was the 18th of October, 1846, close quote. The group arrived at Montrose on October 30th, seemingly just after the second rescue departed. Shurtleff later noted in his recollections that the two teams before him had taken those prepared and, quote, left those who were sick and destitute until cooler weather cleansed the atmosphere and the sick began to revive. Close quote. Consequently, Shurtleff determined to take those he deemed to be, quote, the poorest of the poor and the sickest of the sick, close quote, and only enough able-bodied men and women to care for them. Departing November 3rd, this company carried away only about 60 more saints, but he also made mention of a few, quote, a few weeping saints left behind, close quote, which the Nauvoo trustees estimated at 20 families. The return journey was also prospered, according to Shurtleff. In closing his account, he wrote, "We arrived in Garden Grove November 15th, 1846. In 30 days, we had accomplished a journey of 340 miles without means, except the Lord had furnished, almost without exertion on our part. Our teams looked well. The teamsters had no sickness, and the sick we brought were on the gain, except one sister who died soon after we arrived. I had twice the money I had when we left. I also had beef, flour, corn, salt, and cotton yarn to divide among the needy saints. On a personal note, I believe the one sister who died was my third great-grandmother, Harriet Nixon, and that's how I came to discover and write about the Third Company." It seems that often in Latter-day Saint history, when the suffering and poverty couldn't get any worse, the members of the church were called upon to make yet another seemingly impossible sacrifice. These sacrifices have become the motivating stuff of legend and lore among succeeding generations that caused the fire of the covenant to be kindled anew. Though affecting fewer than the well-known and appreciated travails of Missouri, winter quarters, and Council Bluffs, the suffering of the poor camps in Iowa and the heroics of those who rescued them are commensurate with those episodes and deserving of greater notice and study in and out of the church. Also little appreciated yet may be the full impact of this unexpected catch-as-catch-can rescue of the poor and suffering saints on the plans of Brigham Young as he reevaluated the troubled removal of the saints from Nauvoo both in February and in October and November. Surely it weighed on his mind and into his plans for the spring 1847 exodus to the Salt Lake Valley. Along with the lessons learned in evacuating the poor from Kirtland and Missouri, and those covenants that were repeated 3 different times, this incident undoubtedly solidified the need for more organized methods of bringing the poor along. After much discussion and prayer about the matter, on January 14, 1847, Young announced what became known as the Word and the Will of the Lord, in which God required the stronger, more prepared saints to take with them in their groups of 100 wagons as many of the poor as they could reasonably support. In other words, they were taught to make a focused and concerted effort not to leave the poor behind to begin with. And thereby the foundation was laid for Brigham Young's almost obsessive highly organized efforts to help well over 100,000 poor Latter-day Saints emigrate to Salt Lake in the coming years.